podcast of Tibetan Kung Fu, episode 77. This is the podcast dedicated to our Kung Fu family. Those folks that practice Kung Fu to be a better person first and a better martial artist second. I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. I appreciate you joining me today in episode 77, where we're going to primarily talk about the whole concept, the practice, the skill of listening. A young man and I are standing around talking a couple of weeks ago, and he begins to tell me that he's having a difficult time because he can't quite get where his girlfriend is coming from. He doesn't quite understand what she means, that he's not sure of the message that she's sending. And I said, well, what's happening? And he says, well, she's treating me okay. It's just that she's treating me differently. I ask her if everything is okay, and she says it is, but something doesn't feel the same. So he's getting frustrated, pretty frustrated actually, now that it's going on a few days. So which led us down the conversation about listening. Communication is so dicey anyway. It's so multidimensional. You can look at things from many angles. But with practice, things can get a lot better. And it's never going to be that you have this thing mastered in the sense that you always know, like Don't Lie to Me TV show kind of thing, or you can read minds. It's not that at all, but you can get a better feel for what's going on around you. Things can get fairly frustrating when you're confused about what's being said, or you're trying to determine what someone else means. Most of the students here know that I have a handwritten notebook I started back in the early 90s, and it's packed with these types of lessons that came straight out of learning the Kung Fu and the martial arts. In the last newsletter are the highlights of this particular podcast. There's also a PDF version of the entire podcast, a link to it, and an essay titled Body Language Tales in Poker. That way you can get all this information. You don't have to write it down. You can go to TibetanKungFu.net/newsletter and have it delivered right to your mailbox. Well, when do you know that your listening skills may need some fine-tuning? Well, one of my favorite movies a long time ago was Paul Newman in the 1967 classic Cool Hand Luke. And in there, the old warden says, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." So let me give you some of my epiphany-like moments where I realized that I had failed to communicate, or I had failed to understand. So here I am again in the same sort of situation. Sure indicator I missed something. Then, of course, led me to the next question. How did I miss that? Third, every conversation I have with them ends up in a battle. Number 4, I heard what they said, but it is obviously not what they meant. And ugh, everybody should come with a roadmap. All right, so those were my first 5 things that I knew that would hit me in the head, and I go, okay, I've got to learn to listen and communicate better. Later, though, I learned that there's some other things that can interfere with that communication as well, and some of them is just sincere not knowing. They may not be exactly sure of their feelings at the particular moment, or maybe I'm not. Were they actually being dishonest, or were they just not sure? And then another question I had is, what can I do to learn more about myself, people, and circumstances? I realized that there were times I was listening fine, but I was having more difficulty with particular people or in particular circumstances. So learning how to know myself in these different places helps a lot. Hopefully you can tell I'll be approaching listening from a slightly different angle than most, and that's because I'm basically talking about it from the way that it was taught to me through the Kung Fu. Is that it is multidimensional, and there's many things going on, and you have to learn that you have a responsibility to learn and to listen as you go along, as well as communicate, give and take. So let's talk about active listening for just a moment. It is a very important skill to participate in listening, not just listening passively or what they would just basically define as mechanically hearing. Listening is a skill. And it is an active learned skill, which basically means if you practice it regularly, you can get better with it. So, for example, when the young man asked the question, he got the dreaded, well, I'm fine. And it doesn't sound fine, but you go with what you heard, then you're basically missing some vital information, and you will most likely be perceived as being insensitive because you went with what you heard. And what about what I call the sideways response? For example, I recently asked a student, "How are you doing with your lifestyle habits?" And they responded, "I've been exercising much more regularly." And I paused for a moment. I tilt my head like I oftentimes will do. And I said, most Americans exercise to make up for lack of good lifestyle habits. And that's what I refer to as a sideways response. I ask a particular question, and I get an answer that's kind of coming out of left field somewhere. But before I go any further, how does active listening connect to our Tai Chi and our Kung Fu practice? And it was often said to us when you're practicing push hands or Tui Shao, when you're coming back, listen carefully and pay 100% attention to everything that is happening. And this was something that, you'd hear every day. You would learn very quickly that this was not just a mental practice. It was also a physical, engaging practice. You cannot listen if you are tense, if you are intense, and you can't listen if you are leading. This particular aspect of the training helped me develop literally new relationships. One with myself, my family, my peers, and it helped me tremendously in the martial arts. Learning how to avoid unnecessary tension is absolutely critical if you want to learn the lesson. If you ever expect to be able to move and to respond in anything, both verbally, mentally, emotionally, or physically, you can't be carrying around a lot of excess tension. You also can't be walking around with a lot of extra expectation either. You have to practice letting go of tension, expectation, and pay attention to what's happening at the moment. One of the things that I had to learn literally for myself was developing a deep level of compassion for the challenge of sharing. And trust me, when I was a young man, particularly in my early 30s, I didn't realize that I was probably the cause of a lot of my own miscommunication because I had the challenge of sharing. I actually had more of a challenge of trusting because of several things that had happened earlier in my life. I had kind of pulled myself off, kind of put up walls around myself to make sure I didn't share things that could make me vulnerable too much. And that didn't serve me well, and I ended up in places I didn't want to belong. But worse is I didn't develop skills that I really needed as I was moving forward in my life. So how is it that we may not say what we feel? Everyone sometimes struggles with being understood by others, but we also occasionally struggle to understand and express our own selves. This is important to remember, so you can give yourself and others this headway so that you can ask for sorting time, not to hold someone else's feet to the fire or your own feet to the fire, to come up with an answer, even though you know you're not quite sure what you're feeling. In the ebook, I listed 4 reasons that we may struggle to express ourselves verbally. Since then, I did a little bit more meditation, and it occurred to me I had 2 more that came into my mind. So I have 6 reasons here on the podcast, and I'll go back over to the ebook and update that hopefully this afternoon. As the speaker, sometimes we just don't have the words to express what we're feeling. It just basically comes down to a simple lack of mechanical words to express what we feel. Number 2, we are unsure of our emotions at the moment. Now, this can drive the insecure listener to getting upset because they want to answer now. Or you're going to feel like you're forced or pressured to come up with some sort of answer. Number 3, we are unsure of what we are looking for or what we need. Number 4, we are afraid to express our true thoughts or our feelings. If you have never been in a position where you were not afraid that someone is going to get upset with you because you shared your honest feelings, then you're in a pretty unique and fortunate position. I usually refer to it as the don't rock the boat feeling. Number 5, we may struggle to express ourselves because we're simply making ourselves vulnerable, and that can be difficult. And number 6, we often say what we want to be true. Then a little bit later, we may actually say what we believe to be true. So, for example, I'll give you 2 that just happened recently. Young man and I was talking, and we were talking about his workplace, and he said, I'd really love to be a part of a team like the one that just sealed that deal. We talked a little bit later, and he comes out and says, there's no way I could stand and present like that. So in the first part, he wanted to be able to be part of a team like that. That's what he wanted to be true. But then in his heart, he wasn't sure if he could work through some of the fears or some of the challenges that it would take to be part of a team like that. And so what's unique about a situation like that is that they are both absolutely true. And another example is where I was talking with a student and they said, I'd love to be with a man like that. And the conversation continued a little bit longer, and then they said, there's no way that someone like that would ever find me attractive. And again, both of those statements are true, and we can see how it might be difficult and we struggle inside ourselves to find out what is actually true when you realize that both paradoxes are true. Then you have to decide, what are you going to do about it? Before we get into conversations, setting the stage for a conversation can be a very important component of whether or not the conversation is successful and productive or not. A technique that I was taught by a physician when I was a clinical manager for one of North Carolina's largest family care centers was basically he used to say for 90% of all conversations, it would be a good idea for you to say, I would like to talk with you, not I would like to talk to you. All folks, but particularly children and people that you might supervise or manage, will prefer to be talked with rather than to be talked to. However, there is one set of circumstances that I deliberately don't use the word with, and I use the word to. And that is when I am in the authoritative role and something needs to adjust yesterday. And I want to make sure that there's no ambiguity about this, because this isn't really so much about a conversation. This is about laying out instructions. And for me, that is very different. There could be someone's safety or some very important variables in the mix there that I don't want to see get messed up. Now, in this next section, I titled it The Forced Feelings of Expression. Now, when we are hazy on our feelings, you may feel compelled to try to describe your feelings. You might be in your own meditation and you're really trying to hammer away, what do I feel? What do I feel? And trying to be very specific with some sort of verbiage. Of course, if you're speaking English, the verbiage would be different if you were speaking German or Chinese or anything else. But it's not enough sometimes for us when we say, well, okay, I'm feeling pretty good, but I don't know really how to describe what pretty good means. Or you may not exactly know how you feel, but it's one of those things where I know I'm feeling a little off-centered, but I'm not quite sure what is making that happen. You don't have to force yourself to come up with exactly the right words. Soak on it, and it'll come up for you a little bit later. Now, to a listener, that may seem vague, especially if they're listening to hear some specific words come out of your mouth. But because hazy does sound vague, if you are feeling pressed for an answer, this is exactly what I say. I feel like I'm being pressured to manufacture a description for you right now. And trust me, that's not good. So when I'm not sure, where I feel like my heart and mind are not together, I go into what I call my hover pattern. And I try to just soak in it, and I learn to say, I'm kind of sorting out my feelings right now, and I don't have enough experiences or word to describe to myself, much less you, what I'm feeling right now. What can you do to ensure that you're getting pretty accurate in your listening? At thoughtpartner.com, they listed, be quiet and listen to understand. Don't think about what you're going to say next. So, of course, one sure clue that you're not listening is that if you're interrupting folks. Be curious. If you're not a naturally curious person, then think to yourself, I'm curious about why this person is saying or what their perspective is on those sets of circumstances. So if you want to be an accurate listener, you have to be active, try to be quiet, listen without interrupting, and then be curious. That can help a lot. Just be curious. What is their perspective on this? So skill 1 is listening to what is said. Just simply pay attention to the words. That sounds simple enough, but listening to the words and not filtering or predicting what they're going to say, which goes back to not interrupting and being curious. Skill 2, listen to what is not being said. This is where you catch the void of things and the sideway responses. So a guy asks a girl, hey, would you like to go out with me? And the girl says as she's looking at her watch, I'm awfully busy with my career right now. What did you hear there? I heard, good luck. Doesn't sound like you got much of a chance. In the next example, the guy asks the girl, hey, would you like to go out with me? And the girl says, as she looks at you, I'm awfully busy with my career right now, and I don't have a lot of free time. What did you hear? You might have a chance if you don't become some needy, obsessive guy. In both examples, the girl never directly answers the question if she would like to go out with him, which leads us into skill 3, how things are said. Now, there are plenty of gender-related and psychological books out there that will help you understand what is said. I think that's like what men are in Mars, women from Venus, or stuff like that. That's all great for the experts, and I'm, all excited, hoo-hoo, yes. But basically, it comes down, do you pay attention and apply what you practice or not? My granddad was great at it. He was a police officer, and he enjoyed playing poker, particularly 7-card stud. He could read you like a book. Poker players live by the nonverbal, and they apply it. Because if they don't, you don't play very long. Now, I found an essay, and I converted it to a PDF for you. So if you wanted to know exactly how professional body language readers do it, you can get the newsletter, and it'll have a link in there for body language tells in poker. And it's got great descriptors and illustrations of very important body language tells that you can practice and apply today. Another good reference is the Definitive Book of Body Language by Barbara Peace. I put both the Amazon and iTunes links in the show notes and on the website. And she puts things in there, for example, pay attention to body language changes. So, for example, changes in position or facial movements, which may be a clue that more is going on. Listen for inconsistency to an underlying issue. If you're having a blowout over the dirty dishes in the sink, there's probably something more going on than the dirty dishes in the sink. You're missing something. So a real clue that you're getting close to listening effectively is when you can understand where they are coming from. This doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with them, but you can get a glimpse of their perspective. Learning to listen to what is not said and how it's being said takes practice. You have to learn to slow down, pay attention, stay focused, and you can't be judging and listening at the same time. Training in things such as Tai Chi, meditation, and some of the Qigong exercises can help you with any of those components and skills directly. So we have our first 3 skills: listen to what is said, what is not said, and then how it is said, which puts us at skill number 4, which I always refer to as the golden rule of understanding, and how do we use the information that we received. When you've exercised the first 3 skills, this is where the rubber and the road come together. A good example is where my son and we were sitting down at the table and working on his homework. And he said, "Dad, I've been working harder." And I said, "Yes, son, I know." And he said, "Well, my grades are important to me." I said, "I know that now, much better." And he said, "Well, I've always told you my grades were important to me." And I said, "Yes, you've always told me that your grades were important to you. However, there's a big difference now between when you say it now and when you said it then. And the difference for me, son, is that when you say it to me now, you actually take the time to work on your studies. And that's the difference. When you put action into the words, then I can really believe in the words. So no matter what I hear, don't hear, or believe how it is said, there is really, in the end, only one golden rule to language that can really help you understand where someone is coming from, and that is observe, listen to what they do. As I said earlier, people may be unsure about the words. They may not necessarily even have the words to express what they feel, but their actions will always speak volumes that you'll need to hear. When you can start to match up what they said, what they didn't say, and how they said it, and it matches up with what you witness, you can answer 75 to 90% of your questions. And the rule for us, and the rule that I teach, is that if you're not sure, always believe what someone does more so than what they say. Actions trump words every time. People will waste words, but they will usually not waste their actions. And when you're in total doubt, then you might have to just rely on the good old Jethro Gibbs technique. Trust your gut. If you feel like you're not getting the complete story, there is actually a scientific reason for this, which is going to be the basis of a whole audiobook that I'm going to share with you a little bit later. But if you'll take your time and you pay attention to what is said and what is not said, and if they match up, you can pretty much believe it. Then it comes down to our responsibility. So let's say you've done your listening, you're sharing, you've done well. You have listened, You have observed their actions. Now it's up to you to manage yourself with this new knowledge base. When a person communicates their intent and their actions match up to that intent, then you are responsible for paying attention. You can easily hope that something's going to be different or it's going to go your way and it's going to take you into a real hot mess. And you can't blame someone else because you failed to follow through on your part of the responsibility that you saw, you heard, but you didn't exercise that knowledge. Instead, you may have hoped that things would be different rather than accepting a person or circumstances as they are. Now, that's just as true in business, in relationships, and it is extremely important, for example, in self-protection. When it comes to self-defense, pay more attention to body language, distances, angles, and actions to judge their intent, much more so than you ever listen to the words. So those are the 4 listening skills: what is said, what is not said, how it is said, and then matching the golden rule of action to all of those above. But there are some reasons that you may not listen. We mentioned earlier about listening with curiosity and not trying to anticipate to what someone has said. But here are 14 reasons I had listed and found that you may not listen. The honeymoon period or the infatuation period is in full swing. You're hearing what you want to hear, the words you want to hear, and the brain has been thrown into mute. This could take months to catch up. Number 2, desperation can cloud your listening. Your mind is seeking and it's not listening. Insecurity. Insecurity can force a conversation. Insecurity can create a vacuum that forces a response to either find this magic elixir of words that soothes the insecurity, or it gives you a reason to shut down altogether. Another reason that we may not listen is general fatigue or stress. Just wanting the conversation to take a break so that you can too. Dr. David Burns authored a book called The Feeling Good Handbook. He wrote an essay on some of the other reasons that we may not listen. He says, 1, truth has no chance. You have taken a position that you are right and the other person is wrong. The second is blame. You believe that the problem is the other person's fault. You cannot listen if you have predetermined that they are already at fault. The third reason he listed was the need to be a victim. You feel sorry for yourself. You feel like others are not treating you fairly, and you'll not listen. Defensiveness. You're fearful of criticism and cannot listen when someone shares anything negative or unacceptable. Number 5, being demanding. You feel entitled to better treatment from others, and you get frustrated when they do not treat you in a way that you believe that you are entitled to. Selfishness is another reason that we may not listen. You want what you want when you want it. Mistrust. The conversation is precluded with the belief that they're trying to manipulate you. Then I went back later and I also added drugs, and I know this sounds simple, but any recreational drugs, mood enhancers, medications, and alcohol affect your moods, judgment, and your listening and speaking skills are diminished. Modern communicational devices. Recently, a student told me that he had a blowout with the girl he was seeing because of what came across on a text. Come to find out, he had only overreacted out of defensiveness. When you put the tone in the text, things can change a lot. Be very careful when you're interpreting emails and texts because you're losing 2/3 of the communicational texture. You lose both the tone of which they're expressing themselves and their body language when they express it. You do have the context and experiences of that person, but those can get clouded based on the other emotions I just listed. So avoid emotional interactions via text and email if it's at all possible. That's my best policy. When pressured to give an answer, I usually practice it will be good to talk with you about it when I see you. And that's usually how I respond. Of course, over the phone, you get 1/3 of that back, which is the tone, but you still miss the nonverbal communication. You can always follow up with the golden rule. Did they act upon what they said? And the very thing I listed last, but I probably would say it was one of the most important lessons I learned. Listen as if everything is not personally about you. Put everything else down so that people can share with you without the feeling that they have to walk around on eggshells and not upset you. How many times do you hear, I cannot talk with them because every time I do, they take everything so personal. So if you want to be a good listener, be approachable, which basically means try to avoid putting yourself in these positions where it's very difficult to communicate to you because it can be sensed. So as I pull this to a close, I started Kung Fu training to get to know myself. I was tired of making the same mistakes over and over again as a young man. But my inner circle resources were gone. My dad had died when I was 21, and my grandpas had also passed away. Learning to listen and to pay 100% attention to the things, what is said, what is not said, how it's said, and how does it match up to what they do, changed everything for me. And it happened in one afternoon, and it's been a lifetime of practice ever since. And literally as I was typing up this podcast notes, I received an email after a conversation with an author named Cash Nickerson, who authored the book Listening as a Martial Art. And he's given me permission to read, review, and reference his book in an upcoming podcast. And other announcements, this weekend, Saturday, we're going to have the Teacup and Butterfly Hands Bakwa Workshop. We're also going to have the Joint Lock Workshop with the Shaolin Focus. You can go to TibetanKungFu.net/joint lock for that. And December 26th at 11 a.m., the day after Christmas, we're going to have a health and fitness class, so come by and let's work off of our Christmas festivities. So today we covered, first and foremost, developing some compassion for yourself and for others, that you may not always know exactly how you feel, and even if you know how you feel, it doesn't mean that you're going to have the words to express those feelings, and somebody else may not either. It doesn't mean that you're trying to be elusive or shady. It's just that you may be struggling to find the words. But if you learn to listen with more than your ears, you can pick up a lot. If you'd like to get these show note highlights, go to TibetanKungFu.net/newsletter. You can also get the free ebook and the other book about the body language tales in poker. This is Sifu T.W. Smith, and I really appreciate you joining me today in episode number 77, where we were talking mostly about learning to listen with more than my ears. I want you to go out to have a great practice today, and remember that when you go out to practice your Kung Fu today, you practice your Kung Fu to be a better person first and a better martial artist second. I'll talk with you again real soon.